Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar from Edureka on React Redux. Today we will discuss about what is Redux and what are its various components and how we can use it in React.js. A brief introduction about me. My name is Vipul Jain and I have total 7 years of experience in Microsoft .NET, SharePoint and Microsoft Azure. I have also experience in client-side JavaScript libraries and frameworks like AngularJS, jQuery, JavaScript, and more precisely React.js. So the agenda for today's webinar is, first of all, we will talk about what is the need for Redux, why Redux is required and how it is important. Then we'll talk about what is Redux. Then we will see some of the Redux components, how we can set up those components, how data flows in Redux in combination with React.js, and how React.js is used with Redux. And then we will see a small demo. So this is the agenda for today's webinar. But before going forward, the first and foremost question is that what is the need for Redux? And the first question which comes in our mind is that do I really need Redux? Is Redux really required? So the answer for this question is that if you are building a very simple application, for example, then you might want to use vanilla JavaScript, a simple plain JavaScript. However, as you start to manipulate the DOM, that is document object model, you start making more of AJAX calls and you handle the interactivity, then you can think of using the jQuery. So these are two separate things. In a very simple application, you can start with vanilla JavaScript, but when you have AJAX calls, you start manipulating data, you handle the interactivity, then we can go ahead with jQuery. But with these two approaches, it is very painful to write the code in JavaScript of jQuery specifically. Then we can think of React.js. Then React has multiple components. So for example, React has components like virtual DOM, synthetic events, pure functions, etc. that helps us managing the complexity in our apps. Now, this we talked about how to use that JavaScript, jQuery, and React.js. Now, as data flow gets more complex, suppose your application is more complex and the data flow becoming more complex in nature, there are still some situations when you have to display the same data at multiple places. There may be large state changes that are hard to manage. There may be a requirement in your application to handle, let's say, all the state changes in a single place for consistency. Now, this is where React with Redux comes into picture. So I will repeat that what is the need for Redux? So as data flow gets more complex and complicated in the application, there might be some situations when you have to display the same data at multiple places. There may be some large state changes that are hard to manage. And again, there may be a requirement in the application to handle all the state changes in a single place or in a single place for consistency. That is where the React with Redux comes into picture, because in this webinar, we'll talk about more precisely about Redux and how we can use it with React.js. So how in combination with React, Redux works. So as I said, whenever there are requirements to handle the state changes in a single place, because it's not possible to handle the state changes at multiple places, there needs to be a single place which we will see, which is called store in Redux, which handles your state changes in a single place. So as you can see on the screen, what is the need for Redux? We talked about need for Redux. So because React only gives you the view part in a MVC model. So when I talk about MVC model, I'm talking about here model, view, and controller. And as we all know, and I'm assuming here to be very precise that since it's an advanced topic of React.js and Redux, I'm assuming that the viewers of this webinar are having a little bit knowledge of React.js and what are its various features and components required to implement React. And we all know as React is just the view part. So to control the data flow, something else is required. And that something else with respect to React.js is Redux, because Redux handles your data flow and it is basically used for data flow architecture. So as you can see on the screen here, this is the view part or the browser screen, the web application, which is handled, the view part is handled by the React.js. Now to handle the data flow or the data flow architecture, we need Redux. So this is the need for Redux. In React, we know that the data flow through components. Components are the basic units in React.js, or I can say everything in React.js are components. And we all know that the data flow from top to bottom in React.js. So, which means it follows unidirectional data flow. That is, data always flows from parent to child components. So as you can see on the screen, These multiple colors, all these circles having different colors are showing the components in React.js. The top one is the parent and the bottom one are the child components, you can say. So the data, as you can say, is flowing from parent to child, again from this parent to this child, and from this parent to this child. So all these are components, and the below one I can say are the subcomponents. So one huge implication of one way or the unidirectional data flow is always that your data store is not touched by your view at all. So the data is always flowing in a unidirectional fashion. So which means the child components cannot pass the data to its parent component. So for example, if this is the child component, its parent is this and its parent is this. Now this child component wants to send the data to its parent or parent, then it cannot send using React.js. So we need Redux. At the same time, the non-parent components can't communicate with each other. So for example, all those components who are not having any parents, they cannot communicate with each other. Also, React does not recommend direct component communication this way. So this is also one of the problem if we use alone React.js and we talk about complex data flow architecture or data flow in an application, it's not at all possible by using React.js alone. We need something else which handles our data flow, let's say from top to bottom or bottom to flow, which we say like parent to child relationship or child to parent data flow. That can only be achieved using Redux with React. Now, as you can see here in this diagram, what Redux is offering. Redux offers a solution of storing all your application state in one place, which is called as store. So as you can see in the diagram here, we have a central store. Only one store is shown over here. So components then dispatch. First of all, the first step is dispatching and then subscription. So there are two steps over here. The green ones, the green arrow lines, these lines are the dispatch and the blue one are the subscribe. So components, by using Redux, components then dispatch the state changes to the store, not directly to the component. So whatever the data is getting changed, now it is handled by the store because it is taking some input and giving some output. This is store. The components that need to be aware of state changes can subscribe to the store. So whatever components know that there are some state changes in the store, then they can subscribe to this particular store. So as you can see, this is the dispatch. This particular one circle or the child is dispatching something to store, and these components are subscribing to the store. Now let's talk about what is Redux. We'll talk about now what is Redux. So Redux is, you can say, one of the hottest library for front-end development. It is the successor of Flux, you can say. Redux is predictable state container for JavaScript apps, and it is mostly used for state management for the applications which is having heavy state management or data flow architecture, complex data flow architecture. We use Redux. This was developed by Dan Abramov and Andrew Clark in 2015, and then later these two people also joined Facebook. And it is inspired by Facebook Flux and influenced by functional programming language ELM. So this is just an overview of Redux. I just want to add one more point over here, that recently we have heard that Redux is very popular and now it has become, I can say that, de facto standard. And to support this statement, I can give you evidence that Redux has, if you check on the GitHub, Redux has more stars, more popularity on GitHub as compared to Flux. Now, what are the basic principles of Redux? There are mainly three principles, or I can say three core principles of Redux. First one, that it has a single store. The state is read-only. And third one is that change using pure functions. We only use pure functions, which are called reducers, which we will see later in this webinar in the later slides, that what are these pure functions and how they behave and how they function. But these are the core principles, I can say, the backbone of Redux. These three things. First is the single store. Second is that state is always read-only. And the third one is that the changes are made using pure functions only. So let's talk about one by one about these principles. The first one is single store. So by single store, what I mean is that all your application state is placed in a single immutable store, which means that with only React unidirectional data flow, direct communication between components is not allowed. This we already knew, that with React.js, the direct communication between the components was not allowed. But by using React with Redux, this has become possible because it is using a single store now, which allows the dispatch and the subscription of the components to the store. So I can say that the Redux uses a store for storing all the application state at one place. Component state is stored in the store and they receive updates from the store itself. So components are dispatching something to the store, and then the other components, when they know that there has been something updated in the store, they get subscribed to that particular store. So we have a single store in Redux when we are talking about React with Redux. Now we'll talk about the second core principle, that state is read only. So which means that the only way to mutate state is to emit an action. I repeat, the only way to mutate the state. When I say mutate the state, it means that you can update the state. The only way to mutate the state is to emit an action which describes a user intent. So which means that we can only change the state in Redux by triggering an action, which is an object describing what has happened. So as you can see, the action here is no action. So when I say the action is switch on, the bulb is getting on. It is giving us the light. So this is an action which is based on the user intent. So that is the only way we can mutate the state in Redux. Now we'll talk about the third one, that we can do changes by using only pure functions. So pure functions in Redux are called reducers. They are used to indicate that the how state has been transformed by the action. So which means that the reducers, which are the pure functions in Redux, they basically take two parameters as input, the previous state and the type. So when it takes the previous state, the pure functions comes into picture, which are called reducers, and it gives us the new state. So in this diagram, as you can see, the previous state was off, the bulb was not on. It has been worked upon by a pure functions which are called reducers in Redux, and then we get the new state and the bulb is on. So if I talk about Redux, till here, whatever we have learned about the core principles, we have learned about what is the need for Redux. So if I say in Redux, actions are the most important thing, the first step I can say, so actions are the payloads of information, which sends data from your application to the store. So in the later slides, when we'll talk about the data flow in Redux, we'll see that how this happens, that how action sends data from the application to the store. So they are the only source of information for the store. So basically, store is taking the information from the action. So whatever the action which is based on the user intent is given to the store. And then you send them to the store by method using store.dispatch. So basically, actions are the first point for any Redux with React application, which describes the fact that something has happened, some event has happened, or some action has happened, but they don't specify how the application state changes in response. This is the job of the reducers, as we saw in the previous slide, that they are only used. Actions are the fact that something has happened, but how it has happened, that is the duty, or that is the response of the reducers, or that is the job of reducers. So we define the actions that represent the facts about what has happened, and the reducers that update the state according to those actions. Now comes into picture the store. Now store is the object that brings them together. So what are the responsibilities of the store? As you can see on this slide, what is the store responsibilities? It is holds the application state. The first and foremost responsibility of the store. It holds the application state. It allows access to state via getState method. There is a method called getState. Then it allows the state to be updated via dispatch action. As you can see here, there is a method called store.dispatch. So it allows the state to be updated via dispatch action. Then it registers listeners via subscribe. As I mentioned in the previous slides, that there are two things which components do. First of all, they do a dispatch to the store, and whenever the other components know that there are some changes in the store, they get subscribed to that particular changes. So it is the responsibility of the store to handle this action. It registers listeners via subscribe, that is called a listener. Then it also handles the unregistering of listeners via the function returned by the subscriber. So these are the major responsibility which stores handle in Redux. Now we'll talk about Redux components. So if I talk about what are the main features of Redux still here, so the first and the foremost is Redux is centralizing all your application state in one store. This is the most important thing which Redux do. The second thing is that Redux enforces keeping all state in a single centralized object graph. The third one is that Redux has a immutable store. This is very important to understand, that Redux has a single immutable store, which means state cannot be changed. And if you want to change the state, as we saw, that we have to trigger an action. The action is the only point from where you can change the state, else it is immutable. And the last point related to Redux is that you can instantly see the changes in your browser without losing your current client side state. This is very important, that you are not losing any connection with your client side state. And the time travel debugging, which allows you to step forward and backward through state changes in your code. So these are the four most important features of using Redux. Now we'll talk about Redux components. There are four main Redux components. First one is the action. The other is reducer. The third one is store. And the last is view. So we'll talk about these in detail now. So first of all, we'll talk about the action. What is an action in Redux? So action is a plain JavaScript object, which are payloads of information for the store. So as you can see in this slide, if this is the application, now action is the payload, as I have shown this with a truck diagram. So this is the information which is holding. This is the holding the information or the payload of information for the store. So as I mentioned earlier, that store is taking data. The store is taking data from the action. So what is action? Action are the plain JavaScript objects which are payloads of information for the store. Now as you can see here, this is the action. This is how we specify the action in Redux code, that we have to specify the type and what is its, these are the two parameters, what is the type and what it will return. So this is a function add2 which is taking input as text and it is returning something. So first of all, action must have type property. Action must have type property that indicates the type of action being performed. So this is the type of action being performed. As you can see on the screen, the type of action to be performed is add underscore to do. The second thing is they must be defined as a string constant. This is very important to understand that every action needs to be defined as a string constant. And then again, you can add more properties to it. Now action creator. Functions which create actions are called the actions creator. As you can see, this is the function add2. So this is called the action creator. They takes in the message, converts it into system understandable form or format, and returns a formatted action object. So as you can see again, this type is the mandatory part for any action in Redux. Now we'll talk about the second Redux component, that is reducer. As I mentioned, reducers are the pure functions. Since we discussed about actions, the main point to understand here in Redux is that actions are only the payloads of information. They are not doing any activity or any event or any triggering action on that particular data. They are having the information that something has changed. But what needs to be done after that change is the core responsibility of the reducer. So reducers are the pure functions which specify how the application state changes in response to an action. As we saw that the action are the payloads of the information which is giving input to the store. So in between these two things, there is a component, a Redux component, which is called reducers, which are the pure functions which specify how application state changes in response to an action. So what they do not change the value of the input parameter. First of all, this is very important point to understand that these pure functions. So as I am continuously mentioning pure functions, so the first point to understand about pure functions is because there are two types of functions. One is pure function, another is impure function. So if the function is changing the value of the input data, those are called impure functions. But with Redux and specifically with reducers functions, this cannot happen. So they cannot change and they do not change the value of the input parameter. That's why they are called pure functions. Then they determine what sort of updates needs to be done based on the type of action. In the previous slides, we mentioned about the type of slide. You saw about the type of action. So they determine what sort of update needs to be done based on the type of action and returns new values. It returns the previous state if no work needs to be done. And then the root reducer. There is always a root reducer in Redux. Please remember this. There is always a root reducer which slices up the state based on the state object keys and passes them to their respective specialized reducers. There can be multiple reducers, but there is always a root reducers in Redux. So I just want to mention one point over here. Please remember, for Redux, we always say you need to have one store, but you can have multiple reducers. Please remember, you can have multiple reducers, but you cannot have multiple stores. The store will always be single. The store will always be one. And reducers can be multiple. But in those multiple reducers, there needs to be a root reducer. So the root reducers, what it do is, the root reducer slices up the state based on the state object keys and passes them to their respective specialized reducers. Reducers don't manipulate the original state passed to them. As I mentioned, they are pure functions. So they don't manipulate the original state, but they make their own copies and then updates them. So as you can see in this diagram, this reducer is taking a previous step and an action. So these are the two input things or the two input parameters which a reducers always take, the previous state and the action, and then it processes on these two input parameter and then it gives us a new state, or I can say the new updates or the new changes. So this is how reducer works. This is a function reducer. This is returning some state, which will be the new state. As I said that it will always take the two parameters. The reducer function will always take the two parameter. First one will be, since this is a pure function, so it will take two parameters. First one will be the previous state. As you can see in this code snippet, the first one is the previous state. The other one will always be action which needs to be implemented, and it will always return a state which will be the new state. Now please remember things which you should never do inside a reducer, because since our pure functions, they do not manipulate the input parameters. So you should not mutate its argument. You should not try to change its input parameter. You should not perform side effects like API calls and routing transitions. And you should not call non-pure functions like date.now or math.random, which manipulates or change the input values. You should not use these three things in reducer functions. Now we'll talk about the third component, which is again a very important component, the store. So store is an object which brings all the components to work together. It calculates the state changes and then notifies the root reducer about it. This is very important point to understand, that there could be multiple reducers, but store will always be in communication with the root reducer only. So what it will do, it calculates the state changes and then notifies the root reducers about it. So that is how we implement the store. With store, the data state can be synchronized from server level to the client layer without much hassle, and which makes the development of large applications very easier and faster. So that is how we declare the store in Redux. Let store, let is a keyword. Let and const are the new keyword which are introduced in React Redux JS, and these are I can say ES6 specifications. So let store equal to create store, which is taking input parameter as reducer function. Now store responsibilities, as we saw in the previous slides also. So these are the store responsibility. It hold the application state. It allow access to state via getState method. It register the listeners via subscribe. It allow the states to be updated. And finally, it handles the unregistering of the listeners via the function returned by the subscribe. Now the fourth and the last component in Redux is view. So view is nothing but the thing which is displayed on the screen, or the data or the view which is provided by the store, I can say. So this is the store. This is your data, and this is your browser screen or the application screen which is displayed to the user at the end. So view, it displaying the data which is provided by the store. Now when I talk about view, there are stateful and stateless components. And again, if I categorize these components, there are smart components and dumb components. So what are smart components? Smart components are the managers who are in charge of the action and pass down a function which are called the props. And these pass these props to the dumb components. Dumb components provide information continuously to the smart components if any action is required. They receive them as props and then use them as callback. Now the data flow. How data flow happens in Redux. How data gets flow from the action till the view part or the application part in Redux. So Redux architecture is concentrated on a strict unidirectional data flow. In an application, all the data flow the same lifecycle pattern. I can say logic of your application more predictable and easier to understand. At the same time, it also encourages data normalization to ensure consistency. So that is how it works in Redux. This is the diagram, flow diagram of the Redux application. This application is having all the components which we discussed just now, the actions, the components, the provider components. Then there are two types of components. One are the smart components and the dumb components. The smart components are sending data to the dumb components. And then we have one store. Then we have reducer. So this is how data flows in Redux. So if I talk about a Redux architecture, as I mentioned, Redux architecture revolves around a strict unidirectional data flow. So the data lifecycle in any Redux application, it basically follows 4 steps. So as you can see on the screen, these are the 4 steps and they happen in this order only. So which means that data in an application follows the same lifecycle pattern, making the logic of your app more predictable and easier to understand. So what are these 4 steps? So the first step is that you call store.dispatch action. The second step is the Redux store calls the reducer function you gave it. The third is the root reducer may combine the output of multiple reducers into a single state tree. And the fourth one is the Redux store saves the complete state tree returned by the root reducer. This is the last step, which is having the updated information. This is the very simple data flow diagram. As you can see, there is action, store, the reducers, which is directly working with the store. And then you have the React, which is giving the view part. So first of all, action. How this data flow is happening. An action describes the user intent. It is an object with some type property and some data. The action has a type. Now, second thing is reducer. A reducer always handles the action. A reducer is just a function that is returning a new state. It is taking the previous state and it is returning the new state. Reducer receives the current state and an action, then it returns a new state. Reducers, I can say, typically contains a switch statement. Basically, they have a switch statement based on the multiple types of actions passed. This determines what new state should be returned. Now, this once new state is returned to the store from a reducer, the store gets updated. And finally, the React component, which is connected to the store, displays the information or handles the view part of the application. Now we will see in this upcoming slides that how we can set up the components in Redux. So first of all, we have to do our store ready, get store ready. Then we have to set up the communication among the various components. And then we will prepare the action callbacks. And then we will see this with the example here. Now these are the, I can say, various roles which are used in setting up the components. So first one is the action creator. This is the action creator. The second one are the reducers. These are the reducers. So this was the action creator. These are the reducers. The third one is the views. This is the view part of the application. The fourth one is the store. This is the store. The next component required is the provider. This is the provider. And the last one is the root component, which I can say the root reducer component, the root component. So complete application and the communication among the various components will be handled or will go through among these components only. Now we will see that how communication will happen among the various components. First step is the get store ready. So a command will be given to store to get ready. So as you can see here, store has been said that you are hired, and this is the reducer team to help you out. So the extreme right one, this is the reducer team, and store is being said that you are hired for this application and reducer team is ready to help you out. The second one is to set up the communication. How the communication will be set up. Now provider will be said that the store has been hired, and this is the store which is being hired. Now the provider, what it will say, this is the provider. Provider will say, okay, let me set up a network. Now this provider will set up the network to keep the components updated. Now this is the view part. What it will happen, that this view part will get connected to the latest updates to display to the user. Now after all these two steps has been done, the final step is to prepare for the action callbacks. Now how we will see that what will happen. Now this is the view part. In the previous slide we saw that the view part is getting the updates. What it is saying that I need to make it easy for the dumb components to understand. So what it will do, that it's saying that it should bind the action creator and the dispatcher, because both these are the views and this is the action. And something, as I mentioned, if something needs to be updated because the store is immutable, an action needs to be triggered, and which will be done by action.dispatcher method. So action will call the action creator and the dispatcher so that the dumb component can just call the callback. Now the data flow, we will see how the data will flow among all these components. So the data flow will start from here. So name equal to max, I want to update it with something else. So it will start with the action creator. This is the action creator. This is the view part. These are the reducers. This is the provider and this is the store. I repeat, this is the action creator. These two are the view part of the application. These two are the reducers or the pure functions. This is the store of the application and this is the provider. Now we will see step by step that how the communication will happen among these different components. Now first of all, type is name update. What we want to do, that the type of the action is name update. We want to update the name. Value is max. So this is the first step, and this is available on the view, and we want to update it. So action needs to be triggered. As you can see, this is the first step. Now the second step, the store will be get informed since action has been triggered. As I mentioned, store will always take its input from the action. So second step is store will be called. Now what store will be do? Store will have the current state tree. It will be passed to the reducer function to calculate how new state tree should look like, because something has been changed. So store is informing this to the reducer, and the function of the reducer is, since these are the pure function, it takes the previous state or the previous state tree along with the action and it provides us the new state. Now the fourth step is that the reducer function, the root reducer, will give to the another reducer the sliced part of the tree. The next step is the other reducers will copy the sliced data and will update it, and it will show to the root reducer that how the slice will look like. And finally, in the sixth step of the application, the store will be updated. the store will inform to the provider with the new state or the new state tree as the eighth step. As you can see, this is the new state tree which is being updated to the provider from the store. In the last part, that in the view part of the application, we will have a new state tree which we can re-render to as a component trees. Now we will see how we can use the React with Redux. For using React with Redux, there are some React bindings which are not included in Redux by default. So we have to need to install them explicitly using npm install. Npm is node package manager. We can say npm install -- save React Redux, and then we can add these dependencies along with Babel, React, and Webpack. Now we will see a small demo that how we can use React with Redux.
So I'll start with this first file, which is the main file of any React Redux project or application, that is the index.js. In this index.js, we are using a special React Redux component called provider, which makes the store available to all the container components in the application without passing it explicitly. So what we have to do is you only need to use it once when you render the root component. So here I am rendering my root component having the name as app. So first of all, let me explain you the complete solution structure that what I have created. So I have folders called actions, components, containers, reducers, index.js. So this is the main file. So in this index.js, I am importing all the dependencies which are required. As you can see here, the dependencies which are required, for example, React, React DOM, Redux, and React Redux. In this just index.js file, I am calling the utility called provider, wherein I am calling the root component. So let's start with the presentational components first of all. So as we all know, there are two types of components. One is presentational components and another is container components. So let's talk about first of all the components. So we use most of the time presentational components, but sometimes we need to generate container components as well to connect them to the Redux store. So for example, I'll start with the presentational components first of all. So this is first of all the to-do list.js. These are the different files which I have developed. The to-do list.js, to-do.js, link.js, footer.js, and app.js. This app.js is the root component, I can say, which I have created. So this to-do list.js, what it is doing is it is a list which is showing the visible to-dos. To-dos is an array which I have created with the three properties, I can say ID, completed, and text. So on to-do click, this is an event or a function on to-do click, which is taking ID as a number, which is a callback to invoke when a to-do is clicked. Now other file which I have created is to-do.js. It shows a single to-do item. It is used for a single to-do item. I can say here is a property called text which I have created to-do.proptypes, which is a text. This text is a text to show the completed to-dos, I can say. Now link.js, which will be a link which will show all or completed to-dos. The footer.js, these are having the different links which are used for filters, which I am using in the footer, and it allows user to change the currently visible to-dos. And finally, I have the app.js, which is calling all the other JS files which I have created as a presentational components. So for example, what I am doing over here is that I am calling the container components which I have created as well as the presentational component, which is footer.js. Now, as you can see that there is a method of importing and exporting these files. This is newly introduced in React Redux. And as you can see here that these are two add to do and visible to do list. These are the container components which I'm calling over here. And if I show you the files, if you see over here, the add to do, from where it is coming from the containers and to do. So if I go to the container files which I have created, so one is the visible to do list. So as you can see, I'm importing it in my app.js, which is a root component. And the other one is the add to do.js, which is again I'm importing in the root component. So let's talk about the visible to do list and or I can say the container components. Now, why container components are required when we have presentational components? First of all, these are required to connect the presentational components to Redux. That is why they are required basically. Now, when I talk about visible to-do list.js, which I have created, what is happening over here? Let's talk about it. Now, this file is required by this file, to-do list.js. Now, why it is required? I'll tell you that this is required by the to-do list component because it subscribes to the Redux store. It helps in subscribing to the Redux store, wherein I have mapped state to props. which is a special function which is available in this import connect from React Redux library. Here I am calling a function which is get visible to dos, and in this I have a switch case that I have three actions: show all, show completed, and show active. Now filter link container component. If I talk about filter link.js, what is happening over here? It is a container component that is rendering a link. Basically it is dispatching an action, appropriate action on click. Now visible to-do list, if I talk about it, also filtering the various to-dos according to the current visibility filter based on the filter link.js. Now add to-do.js, it is just returning the HTML part of the application. When I'm going to show you the output, it is just going to show a input box and a button. As I'm using here, there is an input box and there is a button which I have used, which is a submit button, which is the add button. Now one thing here to note is that for container component, we have used connect. Now what is this connect? We are importing connect from React Redux library. This is very important to understand. Let me go to visible to-do list again. Yeah. So here I am using a connect function which provides many useful, I can say, optimization to provide unnecessary re-rendering of the application. So to use this connect, we have to use this map state to props. This is a very important function that tells how to transform the current Redux store state into props which we want to pass to presentational component which we are wrapping. For example, here you can see that it needs to calculate to-dos to pass to the to-do list.js. So we have defined a function get visible to-dos. Now container components also dispatch actions. As I told that container, this is a container, all these are container. They also dispatch action, and for dispatching the action, there is another function, special function called map dispatch to props. So container components also dispatch actions, and here what it is doing is it is injecting a prop called on to do click. As you can see over here, it is injecting a prop on to do click, and we are telling it to dispatch a toggle to do action. So let's talk about actions now. What actions I have created? I'm going to the index.js of the particular actions. So actions, what actions I have created? Add to do is one of the action, toggle to do is one of the action, and set visibility filter is one of the action which I have created. So this was about actions, components, and what are the containers I have created. Now let's talk about reducer functions. So what reducer functions? These are the special functions which takes input from the action as which dispatches an action, and these are the special functions. These are the pure functions which we use in React Redux. Now this is the index.js for a reducer. What I'm doing is I'm declaring a to-do app over here and combined reducers. Now again, Redux provides a utility called combined reducers that helps in combining the other reducer functions. So as you can see over here, I have created visibility filter.js. This is one of the reducer function. Other one is the todo.js, which is again a reducer function, or I can say a pure function which is returning something. So all these reducers I have combined in one place using the combined reducer. So this is the application which I have created in React Redux demo. So here I'll repeat once again what I have done is I have created the components which are the presentational components. So these are the various JS files which I have created, and app.js, as we all know that there needs to be a root component always in React Redux application. So these are the presentational components. Now containers, if I talk about, these are the helping components, I can say, which helps the presentational component to connect to the Redux store, wherein I have created visible these multiple files. Now if I talk about the actions, that what actions needs to be performed on the click of the or the events which needs to be performed, and reducers, this needs to be created which helps actions to get implemented, because reducers are the pure functions which tells that what needs to be done, and how it is presented are the actions. So if I talk about the output of this program, let's talk about the output of this program. This is the output of this program. If I say, I write here Edureka webinar, and if I click on add, so this add to do, this is one of the to do which I have added. Let's say I add presentation, I say presentation, add to do. Again, these are the to do list which is getting added. So if I say, let's say React ES5 to ES6, React ES5 class, I click on add to do. So all on the click of a button, all these to dos are getting added. Now it is showing as of now all. So if I click on any one of them, it gets crossed, and it means it is get completed. So if I click on this, the completed one, it is showing me the completed to-dos. If I click on the active, these are the active to-dos, because although I have added 3, but now it is showing 2 because one of them is completed now. But if you want to show all, if you want to see all the to-dos which you have created, you can click on also. These are the 3 links and also the filters which I was talking about in the footer.js. And this is the text box and button which I was talking in add todo.js, just to show the HTML of this application. So that's all about the demo of this React Redux application. Thank you.